Okay, here we go. Today we are doing 23.3, the last section in chapter 23, where we're starting our conversation about recent space exploration. By the time you get done, you should be able to outline the history of space stations and space shuttles, describe recent developments in space exploration. So we start with the space stations because that's kind of where we left off on our last lecture. A space station is simply a large spacecraft where humans can live for extended periods of time. The first space station that was put into space was Salyut 1. It was put into space by the USSR or the Soviets or the Russians, depending on who was telling you about it. And it was put into space on April 19th, 1971. They just put the main part of it into space. Nobody was on board it yet. They just put the main part into space. Then on June 7th, 1971, they set up 3 Soviet cosmonauts. We don't call them cosmonauts, we call them astronauts, but they call them cosmonauts. And they went to Salyut 1, they stayed for 22 days. At the end of the 22 days, they came back to Earth, but on the way back, there was an accident and they died on their way back down to Earth. Then later that year, Salyut 1 stayed up there, but later that year, then it actually burned up in the atmosphere on its way back in because its orbit decayed. So between 71 and 82, the Soviets put 7 more Salyut space stations in orbit. Their purpose was to study astronomy, biology, the Earth, and the problems of living in space. Because they didn't know what those problems would be at that point. Salyut 6 and 7 were a little bit better than the other 5. Hopefully, you want them to improve with each time they come in. And 6 and 7 actually had 2 docking ports. One, if you look right here, there's a docking port here, and then there's a docking port on the opposite end. And they use those for the crew coming up would dock on one end, and the crew leaving would take the one on the other end back down to the planet, back down to Earth. In 73, the U.S. finally launched our first satellite. It was Skylab. This is actually what it looked like. It was to study the sun mostly, but it was also to study the long-term effects of being in space on humans, because we still didn't really have a whole lot of information about that. In 86, the USSR was going to make a bigger space station where people could live for longer, hopefully. And they put the core of the Mir space station into orbit. Over the next 10 years or so over the next decade, they slowly built onto it. Like every time somebody would go up, they'd take a new part. It was continuously inhabited. That means there were people on it all the time. Longer than any other space station until the International Space Station was put up. Now that has the longest people have been in it record. Are we good? I did not hear a no. I'm taking that as a yes. So after the Cold War ended, the United States and the USSR decided they wanted to kind of work together in exploring space. The US, probably because the USSR always seemed to be ahead of us in that department, and the USSR probably because the United States had more money, to be quite honest. The US even sent some of our astronauts up to the Mir station, which was unheard of at that time for that kind of cooperation to take place. And we worked together on developing the International Space Station. The ISS project, that's ISS, International Space Station. That's what ISS stands for. It involved a lot of different countries. That's why it's called the International Space Station. It was the US and Russia. Remember, we used to be severe allies. And Japan, or not allies, enemies. And Japan, yeah, Japan was right up there in the list of people we weren't supposed to work with. Canada, Europe, and Brazil. Now, there is a weird clause in there that the Chinese are not allowed on the International Space Station. It's something that they did when they first built it. I don't know exactly why, other than the fact that apparently we are still not pleased with China and afraid they're going to take over our country. They built it very similar to the Mir station. They put the first part up in 1997, and they've added on sections a little bit at a time. It's now the biggest space station out there, and it is also the longest inhabited because there have been people on it since 2000. US, the way it used to work, you notice I said used to, is that US space shuttles took the supplies up and brought like empties back. And the Russian Soyuz missions took the people up and brought them back. It was, and still is used to do all kinds of scientific research. Some of that is still about what life would be like in zero gravity or in space, or how we could make that zero gravity the best possible. You good? We kept sending up the Apollo spacecraft, but the problem with the Apollo spacecraft is, well, any spacecraft, to be honest, is that it's expensive. These are not cheap to build, folks, and everybody at this point should kind of be going, duh, right? But the biggest problem with the Apollo spacecrafts is they can only be used one time. They went up, they came back down, and that was it. They could never be sent back up again. And there wasn't really a lot of room to carry other things with them. So NASA decided, okay, we need something else. We need something that you're going to be able to have bigger crews. You're going to be able to take stuff up with you when we need stuff to go up, bring stuff back when we need it to go back, come back. And for goodness sakes, we need to be able to use $1 billion aircraft more than one time. So they came up with a new aircraft. They developed the space shuttle. There have been 5 space shuttles to date. The Columbia, the Challenger, the Discovery, the Atlantis, and the Endeavour. Those are the only 5 the US has ever sent up into space. Now the Soviets built one, it was called the Buran, but they never actually sent it into space. I'm not entirely sure why, I'm not sure what happened, but they never sent it with anybody on board. This is actually what a space shuttle looked like. You will notice that there are a couple weird looking things here in the background, and then the thing that everybody recognizes, the orbiter, right? Are we good? Okay. The three main parts are the liquid fuel tank, the booster rockets, and the orbiter. The boosters are the small ones on the side, the small white ones on the side. Those would be the first to get used. Those contain solid fuel, so it would kind of get them started. It would move the shuttle and the big, huge liquid fuel tank. It would get it started and move it up into space a little bit, but not break the atmosphere. Once that fuel was used up, those would actually separate, and they would fall back down to Earth, and they would fall into the ocean with parachutes, and then they would be picked up out of the ocean, recovered, cleaned up, and reused on the next mission. When these went out, then the liquid booster would kick in. Are we good? Okay. The liquid fuel tanks then would push the shuttle actually up into space and into orbit out of our atmosphere. And when it was empty, then it would also separate. The problem with that is, as it wouldn't actually go into orbit, it would just get up far enough that it could push the shuttle, and the shuttle could go into orbit, but it couldn't. And so it's out of fuel, so what's it do? It crashes back down to Earth, right? But because it has to go back through our atmosphere again, it actually burns up on its way back to Earth. So it is not reusable. Then the orbiter would continue on with its mission. So here's it falling away, and then the orbiter continues, and it does whatever it needs to do. And then when it's done, it comes back to Earth. It re-enters the atmosphere. The outside temperature of this thing, as it's re-entering the atmosphere, can reach 1,500 degrees Celsius. For those of us who don't use Celsius, that's 2,732 degrees Fahrenheit. So the outside temperature gets really, really hot. They do not use the, or did not, I should say, use the engine, or not the engines, the rockets at all when they were coming in. So this was more of a glider once it got into the atmosphere. The shuttle then actually lands on land at Kennedy Space Center in Cape Canaveral, which is in Florida, or at Edwards Air Force Base in California. Occasionally they had to land at someplace else, and then they'd have big old trucks come and haul it back down to Florida. The space shuttle made 20 successful missions before the first disaster. From 81 to 85, 20 missions in 4 years. And then January, so everybody was feeling really comfortable with this, and they decided to take kind of their first passengers up. January 28th, 1986, put that phone away or it's going to be mine. If I see it out again, it's mine, you understand, yes?
Yeah.
Fabulous. Get your notes taken. January 28th, 1986, there was a problem with an O-ring. Guys, you know how little those are, right? O-rings, they're just what they say. They're a little tiny ring. In one of the rocket boosters. And as a result of that, the Challenger started to break apart 73 seconds after it launched. It was, people could still see it. It was high. It was not high enough that it was into the atmosphere. I remember this day, you guys. I was like 25 years old. All 7 of the crew members died. Everybody was so excited because the first teacher ever was going into space. Her name was Krista McAuliffe. And the whole country was just totally shocked when this happened. NASA took a couple of years off, improved the safety of the space shuttles, and then proceeded to continue to send space shuttles up with 87 more missions completed without a problem. Until. Are we good? Okay. January 6, 2003. The takeoff looked really good. Everything was going fine, or so they thought. What had actually happened is that as it was taking off, a little piece of foam broke off the fuel tank of the Columbia. It hit the front edge of the wing and broke a tile. That tile just happened to be a heat shield tile. Everything was fine. They got up into space, no problem. They got their mission completed, no problem. And on re-entry, because that heat tile was broken apart, as it's going through these 2,732 degree time during its descent, the shuttle broke apart. It was more than the shuttle could take because of that one little heat shield. Again, all 7 of the crew died. They ended up finding pieces of the space shuttle all over the southern United States. At that point, space shuttle missions stopped for another 2 years. NASA again worked on safety, trying to figure out what went wrong, trying to make it as safe as possible. In 2011, the space shuttle program ended and all shuttles were retired. They are currently using private companies are building spacecraft and sending them up with help from NASA, but it's not a NASA-sponsored thing. Landsat satellites. We've already talked a bit about satellites, so we're not going to talk tons and tons and tons about them. But Landsat satellites are imaging satellites. You guys remember that means they take pictures of the planet. And these take pictures of Earth's land and coastal areas. This is what's helping to monitor climate change. So they're looking at the ice flows and things like that. And they're watching how Earth systems interact with each other. So how does our oceanic system interact with our land? How does the gases in our atmosphere interact with everything else in our planet? Rovers. So now we have to go like outside our planet. They're using spacecraft to take things farther and farther. The first ones are rovers. These are spacecrafts that are actually on wheels. They're used to collect data from other planets. We've sent several rovers to Mars. The Pathfinder missions in '97, they took this little robot, and I can never remember this little robot's name, but I always thought it was funny that it got stuck on a rock named Barney. I know, right? And it couldn't get around it. It couldn't figure out how to do that. Then Spirit and Opportunity in 2004, Curiosity in 2011, and the most recent is Perseverance, just went up last year. It went up the end of last year, and they started getting data back from it in February of this year, so just a couple of months ago. They are there to gather data to determine if life could exist on Mars. If we could move there, if it ever did exist. In this case, Perseverance is the one looking for ancient signs of life. It's collecting samples. It's going to be there for about 10 years, they are hoping, and then they are hoping even more that they will be able to retrieve that rover and bring it back with all of the samples that it's collecting. The Cassini went to Saturn. It's there to study the moons and the rings and to study the planet itself. The Huygens probe was sent by Russia, USSR, Soviets, whatever you want to call them. It is studying Titan, one of Saturn's moons, one of Saturn's biggest moons, which actually has a lot of the conditions on it that would be needed for life to take place. So they're looking to see if there was life or if there currently is some kind of life on Titan now. Deep Impact, I thought this one was really kind of funny. This was a probe that was sent up on purpose to collide with a comet. Set up. Its whole purpose was to collide with the comet. The probe was going to collide with the comet, and then there was another spacecraft that was going to fly by and collect all of the data that the probe sent out after it. It was called Deep Impact for a reason. Boom, right? We are hoping by 2030 to send our first manned missions to Mars. Guys, if you think about it, 2030, that's not very far away. Okay, and they are still, according to everything I've seen and heard, they are still on track to do that. Questions? Seriously? Okay. Okay then.